The HOA thought they could bully a farmer into submission. They didn't no ID uncover something that would shut them down permanently. I bought the farm because I was done being told how to live. Years of dealing with petty rules, warning letters, and passive-aggressive notices had drained every ounce of patience I had. I wanted space, quiet, and control over my own life. So I went far, really far. Miles away from subdivisions, gated communities, and neatly trimmed lawns. The property sat beyond rolling hills and long dirt roads, surrounded by open land and sky. No neighbors close enough to complain. No boards. No committees. Just a farmhouse, fields, and the freedom I'd been chasing for years. Before signing anything, I did my homework. I checked county zoning records, reviewed land use maps, and confirmed in writing that the property was not part of any homeowners association. The seller confirmed it. The county confirmed it. Even the title paperwork was clean. This land was agricultural, independent, and completely outside HOA jurisdiction. That assurance was the reason I paid a little extra and moved fast. Peace of mind was worth every dollar. The first weeks were everything I hoped for. I repaired the old barn, fenced off areas for livestock, and started planning crop rotations. Mornings were quiet, broken only by wind through the fields and the sound of birds. I worked long days and slept better than I had in years. For the first time, no one cared what color my roof was or how high my grass grew. I finally felt like the land belonged to me and that I belonged there. That illusion didn't last. One afternoon, I found an envelope stuck awkwardly in my mailbox. It looked official, stiff paper with bold lettering. At first, I assumed it was county-related, maybe a tax notice or agricultural permit update. But when I opened it, my stomach tightened. It claimed I was in violation of community guidelines. It listed unapproved structures and failure to pay dues. At the bottom, it referenced an HOA name I had never heard of. I reread it 3 times, convinced it had been misdelivered. This had to be a mistake. I didn't live in any community. I owned a farm, miles away from the nearest subdivision. Yet the tone of the letter was confident, almost threatening, as if they had absolute authority. It warned of escalating penalties if I didn't comply. Standing there in the dirt driveway, holding that letter, I felt something shift. Confusion turned into irritation, then into resolve. I hadn't escaped control just to be dragged back into it by someone who didn't even belong on my land. Whatever this was, I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't going to end quietly. After that first letter, I expected silence once they realized their mistake. Instead, the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. What started as a notice quickly became a demand. They listed fines that supposedly accrued daily, late fees stacked on top, and warnings about legal enforcement actions. Every envelope carried the same confident tone, as if they were daring me to challenge them. It was unsettling, not because I believed them, but because of how boldly they acted without ever verifying the facts. I tried to handle it calmly at first. I called the number on the letter, expecting a quick apology and correction. The woman on the phone didn't hesitate. She said my property was within their managed area, and that I was required to comply. When I told her my land was agricultural and not part of any HOA, she brushed it off and said, "That's not what our records show." That was it. No discussion. No interest in proof. Just a flat assertion of power. A week later, a certified letter arrived. This one claimed I had ignored prior warnings and was now facing forced compliance. They demanded I remove my barn additions, stop all farm-related activity deemed non-conforming, and pay outstanding dues immediately. Reading it felt surreal. They were trying to apply suburban rules to a working farm, rules about fencing styles, building colors, even noise. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so serious. The situation escalated quickly. I started receiving emails and phone calls. Some were polite, others openly hostile. One message accused me of intentionally bypassing the HOA, as if I'd done something illegal by buying land outside their reach. Another warned that eviction proceedings could begin if I didn't resolve my status. That line stuck with me. Eviction from land I legally owned outright. What disturbed me most wasn't the threat itself. but the assumption behind it. They genuinely believed they had the authority to remove me. That level of confidence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from practice, from having done this before and getting away with it. I stopped responding after that, not because I was afraid, but because I realized something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intimidation. They were counting on me panicking, paying, or backing down without checking the law. Every letter was designed to overwhelm and exhaust me into submission. Instead, it had the opposite effect. I started organizing every document, every map, every email. If they wanted to play authority, I was ready to make them prove it. Because if they were this aggressive with someone who knew their rights, I could only imagine what they'd done to people who didn't. The situation crossed a line the morning they showed up in person. I was repairing a fence when I noticed two vehicles turning onto my dirt road slow. Deliberate. Like they owned the place. They stopped near my gate, and two men stepped out wearing black shirts with bold lettering across the back. They didn't introduce themselves right away. They just stood there, scanning my land, taking photos, whispering to each other like inspectors on a job site. When they finally spoke, it wasn't a request. It was a declaration. They said they were there to document violations and confirm non-compliance. One of them mentioned that this visit would be added to my file. I asked them plainly what authority they had to be on my property. They replied with rehearsed confidence, claiming enforcement rights granted through the HOA. No paperwork, no court order, just words. I told them they were trespassing and asked them to leave. That's when their attitude changed. The politeness vanished, replaced with thinly veiled threats. One of them said things would get very expensive if I kept resisting. The other suggested it would be easier if I worked with them now, instead of fighting later. It wasn't about rules anymore, it was pressure. They walked the perimeter anyway, snapping photos of the barn, the fencing, even my equipment. They criticized everything, pointing out imaginary violations as if they were facts. I stood there listening, anger building with every sentence. These people had driven miles off paved roads to enforce rules that didn't apply. And they did it with total confidence. Before leaving, one of them handed me a notice printed that morning. It warned of imminent legal action, including forced access to the property for corrective measures. Forced access. That phrase stuck in my head long after they drove away. It wasn't just harassment, it was a claim of control over land they didn't own and never had rights to. As their vehicles disappeared down the road, the quiet returned. But it felt different. Heavier. More deliberate. I knew then that ignoring them wasn't enough. They weren't bluffing in the way small bullies bluff. This was organized. Coordinated. They had forms, processes, and people whose job it was to intimidate landowners into compliance. That visit changed everything. It stopped being an annoyance and became a challenge. I wasn't just defending my farm anymore, I was standing between them and the precedent they were trying to enforce. And if they thought I'd fold because they showed up with clipboards and threats, they had badly misjudged who they were dealing with. After they left, I didn't waste time arguing or venting. I went straight to work, but not in the fields. I sat down with every document I had and started pulling records. Deeds, zoning maps, county plats, historical filings. I wanted facts, not assumptions. If they were claiming authority, I needed to know exactly where that claim came from, and whether it had any legal standing at all. The deeper I dug, the worse it looked for them. County records clearly showed my property lines ending well beyond the HOA's legally registered boundary. There was no overlap, no shared easement, no annexation agreement. My land had never been part of their development, not historically, not accidentally, not temporarily. That alone should have ended the matter. But it didn't explain why they were so confident. That's when I expanded the search. I looked at past amendments to their bylaws, changes to their managed area, and old filings that most people never read. Buried in those documents was a pattern. Over the years, the HOA had quietly redrawn service maps that were never approved by the county. Internally, they treated those maps as official, even though they had no legal force. They were enforcing rules based on paperwork that existed only within their own organization. I started cross-referencing complaints and public records. What I found made my stomach drop. There were others. Farmers, rural homeowners, small landowners just outside the subdivision people who had received similar letters. Some had paid fines just to make it stop. Others had torn down structures they never needed permission for. A few had even sold their land after being threatened with lawsuits they couldn't afford to fight. This wasn't a mistake. It was a business model. The HOA collected dues and penalties from people who were never legally part of it, counting on fear and confusion to keep them quiet. And it worked until someone checked the records closely enough to expose it. I documented everything. Screenshots, copies, timelines, every threat letter, every visit, every inconsistency between what they claimed and what the law actually said. By the time I finished, I wasn't just defending myself. I had evidence of systematic overreach, possibly fraud. I contacted the county planning office and requested written confirmation of jurisdiction. Then I reached out to a real estate attorney and laid everything out. Their reaction said everything. This wasn't a simple dispute. It was serious. And once the paper trail was complete, I knew something else too. The HOA had pushed too far this time. And they were about to find out what happens when intimidation meets documentation. Once everything was documented, I stopped playing defense. I filed formal complaints with the county, attaching maps, deeds, and the HOA's own filings side by side. The contrast was undeniable. Within days, the county confirmed in writing that the HOA had zero jurisdiction over my property. That single letter dismantled their entire case, but I didn't stop there. Not after everything I uncovered. My attorney helped escalate it further. We submitted evidence to state regulators, detailing how the HOA had been collecting money and enforcing rules beyond its legal boundary. That changed the tone overnight. Suddenly, the organization that had been threatening eviction went silent. No calls, no letters, no inspectors, just quiet. Then the pressure shifted onto them. Investigators requested records. The HOA was forced to explain why their internal maps didn't match county records. Board members were questioned about enforcement practices. The same confidence they had shown on my land vanished when they had to justify it under oath. What had once been brushed off as administrative error now looked like deliberate overreach. Local news picked up the story after another affected landowner came forward. The narrative changed from a private dispute to a public issue. People started asking how long the HOA had been doing this, and how many had paid out of fear. The answers weren't flattering. The consequences came fast. The HOA was ordered to cease all enforcement outside its registered boundaries immediately. All fines issued beyond those limits were declared invalid. Refunds were required. Board members resigned one by one as legal exposure mounted. The organization didn't just lose the case, it lost credibility. As for me, the eviction threat was formally withdrawn. If you enjoy real stories where bullies overstep and face real consequences, hit subscribe. These HOA stories get crazier every week.